On a nationally televised broadcast seen by over 11 million viewers, Jasmine Crockett and Karoline Leavitt stood on opposite sides of a debate about women in power. But when Karoline unveiled forged documents and accused Jasmine of corruption, the room went cold. Jasmine said just 7 words, and within 48 hours, she filed a defamation lawsuit that would shake the political media to its core. What began as a clash of words became a legal war. Sponsors vanished, emails leaked, and across talk shows and courtrooms, the silence Jasmine held turned into the loudest reckoning of Karoline's career. In a world that rewards outrage, what happens when the quiet one sues and wins? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The segment was billed as a landmark event. Voices of Power, Women Reshaping American Politics, aired primetime across every major network. The set was sleek, clinical, and uncomfortably pristine. Chrome trim, glowing blue LED accents, and 3 mounted cameras weaving silently through the air like silent predators. Jasmine Crockett sat poised, spine straight, eyes focused, her every breath measured like a metronome. She had done dozens of panels before, but something about tonight, it was off. Karoline Leavitt was too still, too rehearsed. Her hands remained clasped in her lap for most of the opening 10 minutes, but every few seconds she'd glance down at the folder on her thigh, like it held a secret she couldn't wait to unseal. Jasmine saw it, she clocked it, but she said nothing. When the conversation shifted from representation to accountability, Karoline struck. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even wait for the moderator to finish his question. She simply leaned forward, uncapped the folder with a slow, deliberate flick of her wrist, and held up 2 pages. Pages that hadn't passed through any vetting, hadn't been disclosed in pre-panel agreements, and hadn't been seen by anyone on set until that very moment. Her voice dripped with performance. Before we go any further, I think the American people deserve to see this. The host blinked. The camera operator cut to a close-up without being told. And there it was. Faux official letterhead, time-stamped emails, and a spreadsheet with Jasmine's name boxed in red, claiming she'd received over $180,000 from a shadowy PAC linked to radical activist networks. It was a fabrication, an intricate, calculated piece of political theater. There was no such transaction. The PAC was real, but the document had been doctored. Metadata stripped, header blurred, context erased. Karoline didn't just smear Jasmine. She constructed the illusion of corruption, built it pixel by pixel, line by line, like a house of mirrors designed to collapse on command. "Tell me, Congresswoman," Karoline purred, "what exactly did they pay you for?" Every head in the studio turned. The host hesitated, unsure whether to intervene or let it spiral. The air thickened. One of the journalists shifted, then quickly looked down. A bead of sweat slid down the cameraman's temple. Jasmine, however, didn't even flinch. She didn't reach for the paper. She didn't ask for a fact check. Instead, she turned slowly, deliberately, toward the main lens, the live feed pouring into 17 million homes, and stared into it like it was a courtroom. Then she said, with the precision of a closing argument, "I'll answer you in court." No shout, no emotion, just verdict. And the room knew it. She had just flipped the script. The camera's red light faded, but the damage had already detonated. Jasmine didn't wait for the post-show debrief, didn't engage with the moderators or wave to the viewers. She walked straight through the backstage corridor, past the buzzing producers and stunned interns, her heels clicking like a metronome of restraint. Her chief of staff, already on the phone with legal, matched her pace. In the back seat of the SUV waiting outside, Jasmine said only 6 words. "Find out who printed that document." By the time she landed back in Dallas, her legal team had convened in a midnight session at a high-rise conference suite that smelled of stale coffee and printer ink. They pulled the footage, froze the moment Karoline held up the doctored file. Zoomed in. The letterhead didn't match any legitimate source. The file's source ID had been scrubbed. The timestamps were inconsistent. It wasn't sloppy. It was deliberate. What Karoline had done wasn't political posturing. It was an act of public sabotage, engineered with intent to discredit a sitting congresswoman on live television. By hour 36, Jasmine's lead counsel, Elijah Marin, a stone-faced constitutional litigator who once faced down a sitting governor, had drafted a civil complaint that read like an indictment. Every sentence was weighted, every paragraph cut like wire. The claim, defamation with malice aforethought, fabricated materials, strategic character assassination. The damages sought weren't symbolic. They were generational, $100 million for what the suit called irreversible political and professional harm inflicted through orchestrated misinformation. At precisely 9:17 a.m. on the second day after the panel, the lawsuit was electronically filed in federal court and auto-uploaded to Pacer. Within minutes, legal journalists picked it up. By 10 a.m., Politico and Reuters had posted breaking news alerts, and by lunchtime, the world had split. One half of the internet recoiled. Isn't this a little extreme? She should have just corrected the record. Another thin-skinned Democrat crying victim. But the other half roared in response. She didn't run to Instagram, she ran to court. That's not fragility, that's force. Screens were flooded with side-by-side comparisons of Jasmine's stone-cold composure and Karoline's triumphant smirk. A political strategist tweeted, "We used to say sue them into silence as a joke. She just made it a doctrine." Still, Jasmine remained utterly quiet. She didn't tweet. She didn't text a statement to the press. She didn't even like a comment. But in every newsroom, courtroom, and strategy session across the country, her silence was deafening. Not passive, potent, not avoidance, tactical withholding. And to those who understood power, that silence wasn't absence. It was a countdown. But power, when it starts to crumble, doesn't collapse with sound. It fractures in silence, looking for shadows to bargain in. 44 hours after the lawsuit went public and Jasmine's silence became the most deafening force in national politics, the temperature inside her Dallas office dropped. The blinds were half drawn. The hallway outside buzzed with reporters trying to bait a statement. Inside, Jasmine sat across from her attorney, reviewing deposition timelines when her chief of staff, Samira, entered without knocking, holding out a phone like it was evidence from a crime scene. "Encrypted sender," she murmured. "No CCs, no legal header, but you'll recognize the tone." Jasmine took the phone, read the message once, and didn't blink. It was Karoline. No signature, but unmistakably her. Voice stripped of performance, but soaked in strategy. "I don't know if this will reach you. I need to say I'm sorry. Things moved too fast. I trusted the wrong team. I didn't expect it to spiral this far. I thought I was being bold, not reckless. If there's any room left for mercy, please consider ending this." The punctuation was off. The grammar fractured in just enough places to sound urgent, almost human. But the core was clear. She wasn't apologizing for what she did, only for the fallout that followed. No ownership, no accountability, just a passive surrender wrapped in the language of remorse. Jasmine stared at the screen for a few seconds longer, then handed the phone to her attorney. Her voice was low, but it landed like steel. If it was sincere, it wouldn't be secret. The message was archived. No response sent, no acknowledgement given. That should have been the end of it. But the email didn't stay private. No one on Jasmine's team leaked it. They didn't have to. Somewhere between Karoline's PR consultant and a desperate junior staffer trying to rehabilitate her image, the message found its way into the bloodstream of the internet. It surfaced first on a small political blog, then exploded onto Twitter, screenshot, timestamp, and all. Within hours, it was dissected on podcasts, quoted on late-night news panels, and debated in think pieces with titles like "When Power Whispers Apologies." The irony scorched. Karoline, who had weaponized the public arena to humiliate Jasmine, was now retreating to the shadows, begging for clemency with no witnesses. And the public? They saw through it. "You tried to crucify her in HD," one commenter wrote, "but asked for forgiveness in lowercase." The court docket remained untouched. Jasmine didn't move a muscle. But outside her office, the winds were shifting. And for Karoline Leavitt, the spin cycle was over. The reckoning had begun. The public backlash had scorched across every platform like wildfire, but it was the absence of Jasmine's voice that turned it from news cycle to cultural event. The leaked email had detonated online outrage, but it was what came next that reshaped the terrain entirely. Jasmine didn't tweet, didn't post a photo, didn't sit for a single interview. And yet, she was everywhere. On Monday morning, the Washington Post printed a 3-column front-page feature titled Jasmine Crockett, Power and Restraint. Below the headline was a photo, not from the panel, not from the courtroom, but of Jasmine walking alone past the Lincoln Memorial, her expression unreadable, the sky behind her the color of ash. The column didn't dwell on drama. It drew blood with analysis. In an age where volume is mistaken for vision, it read, Congresswoman Crockett has done the unthinkable. She has stayed still and made the world adjust to her pace. By noon, CNN aired a primetime special, split-screen footage of Karoline's on-air accusation, replayed beside Jasmine's now viral reply, I'll answer you in court. A chyron at the bottom of the screen read, the most controlled moment in modern politics. That same day, MSNBC convened a roundtable with 3 former senators, each trying and failing to recall a time when a public official said less and commanded more. But while anchors waxed poetic and op-eds turned her into legend, Jasmine didn't flinch. She wasn't watching the coverage. She was in a subcommittee room deep inside the Capitol, reviewing amendments to a transportation equity bill, with a red pen in hand and a cold coffee at her side. The cameras weren't invited. Her staff didn't issue statements, no sound bites, no damage control. While the world tried to paint her in gold leaf, she kept her hands in the ink. And still, the irony was as cutting as it was cruel. She was being applauded not for what she said, but for refusing to dignify a lie that should never have been spoken. But silence, when it turns on you, doesn't knock. It seeps in, seeps under, and then takes everything. In the days following the leaked email, Karoline Leavitt's world began to shrink, not in headlines or hearings, but in contracts, the kind printed on glossy paper and signed with champagne. Luxform Skincare, the luxury brand that once featured Karoline's face in digital billboards across Miami and LA, was the first to vanish. The termination notice came not with a call, but in a 1-page PDF emailed at 2:13 a.m. Effective immediately, all promotional and ambassadorial relationships are concluded. No further public association is permitted. There was no follow-up, no explanation, just a silent erasure, like she had never existed in their campaign reels to begin with. The next morning, Civic Rise Energy, a flashy political lifestyle brand aimed at millennial conservatives, pulled her affiliate code from its website and sent out a bulk email to its user base. We believe in accountability. Our partnerships reflect that. Karoline didn't post about the losses, but inside her team's Slack, the panic was visible. Messages were short, clipped, littered with, checking with legal, is there a PR patch, and can we get ahead of this? But they couldn't, because the sponsors weren't waiting for court rulings or explanations. They were reading the climate, and the climate had turned. Her once thriving podcast, No Filter with Karoline, had its ad slots pulled within 72 hours. Her analytics dashboard showed a bloodbath. Follower count dropping by thousands per day, episode engagement cut in half, incoming inquiries reduced to near zero. The microphone she once weaponized now sat on her desk like an unused relic. She tried recording. 3 takes, 4 scripts, but nothing stuck. Her voice cracked. Her tone faltered. And in every attempt, she sounded less like a firebrand and more like someone choking on the smoke of their own undoing. For someone who had built an empire on being untouchable, the silence around her wasn't just unsettling, it was surgical. And as her public image bled out in real time, the fracture inside her own camp was no longer quiet, it was structural. The morning began with a half-empty inbox and ended with an open envelope placed delicately on the edge of Karoline's desk like a verdict. No salutation, no sign-off. Just one sentence written in calm, deliberate cursive, the ink still slightly smudged. You're not being attacked, you're being revealed. It was from Rachel Lynn, her senior PR advisor, once the sharpest strategist in the room, the woman who had crafted her debate sound bites and whispered the killer phrases, seconds before cameras rolled. Rachel was loyal, had been loyal until now. Her desk sat stripped bare by noon, nameplate gone, drawers emptied. Only a single iced coffee remained sweating on the corner, untouched. Karoline stood staring at the note for a full minute, her face unreadable. Then she folded it in half with mechanical precision and slipped it into her blazer pocket. Not a word spoken, not a question asked, just the hollow echo of retreat. That afternoon, an emergency strategy meeting was called. In the past, such gatherings filled 2 floors. Now the war room was reduced to 4 souls. Karoline, her legal counsel, a junior assistant who looked like she wanted to disappear, and a comms intern patched in via glitchy Zoom audio. The air was dense with failure, the silence between sentences louder than the voices attempting to salvage her future. On the projector screen, graphs in freefall, audience retention, cut in half, newsletter unsubscribes, spiking, negative sentiment index, off the charts. "We need a reset message," the intern offered weakly. "There is no reset," Karoline snapped, then caught herself, swallowing hard. No one looked up. There was no plan on the table, no roadmap, no slogan that could walk her out of this. Just data, loss, and time running out. She had once been the conductor of chaos. Now she was buried beneath it. And worst of all, she could feel it. They weren't brainstorming. They were bracing. But as Karoline's inner circle crumbled under the weight of optics and abandoned alliances, something far more lethal arrived, not with noise, but with unnerving precision. It came at 6:42 a.m., delivered into the inbox of Jasmine Crockett's lead counsel under high-level encryption. No subject line, no introduction, just a single PDF attachment and a digital signature confirming the sender. A former campaign staffer from Karoline's 2022 congressional run. The file was clean, metadata intact, unaltered. Its title sat at the top of page 1 in bold, unapologetic font. Talking points for minority opponents. It read like an operation manual. This wasn't commentary. It wasn't careless language caught on a hot mic. It was structured, systematic, and deeply sinister. The opening page broke down debate tactics by demographic. Black women, Latina candidates, Asian American progressives. Under the heading Psychological Leverage, it outlined targeted methods to elicit emotion, interrupt early and repeatedly, break rhythm, laugh subtly during responses, project condescension, use terms like entitled, angry, or too passionate. These labels resonate with suburban independents. Page after page, it described how to weaponize bias, how to provoke a specific reaction, how to make dignity look like fragility on camera. One line circled in red ink chilled Jasmine's team to the bone. If they raise identity issues, pivot to meritocracy, suggest victimhood, make the room doubt their stability. It was not strategy. It was sabotage masquerading as political instinct. And Jasmine, unknowingly, had been walking through this exact blueprint, live, unguarded in front of millions. She hadn't just endured a public ambush. She had survived a psychological trap engineered to collapse her in real time. Now, for the first time, they had proof it was never spontaneous. It was never accidental. It was intentional. And that intent was the difference between a harsh debate and a coordinated dismantling of character. The kind of difference that didn't just sway public opinion, it rewrote the stakes in a courtroom. And just when the document had begun to shift the narrative, the next piece arrived like a warhead, quiet, precise, and undeniable. It didn't come from a courtroom filing or an email chain between lawyers. It came in the form of a raw audio file, barely labeled, sent anonymously to Jasmine Crockett's legal team at 3:17 a.m. The file name was deceptively generic, Staff Mosh Training Mosh Session Ma 3.mp4, but what it contained would destroy the illusion of coincidence forever. Jasmine's lead counsel, Elijah Marin, received it first. He opened it without ceremony in the stillness of his home office, coffee cold beside his hand. The first few seconds were nothing but soft ambient rustling, papers shuffling, chairs scraping, nervous laughter in the background. But then came the voice, clear, measured, Undeniably Karoline Leavitt's. Make her look unstable. She'll break if you act calm and condescending. Elijah sat back in his chair, spine rigid. He didn't stop the recording. He turned the volume up. Caroline's voice continued, casual and crisp, like someone explaining a morning routine. Don't interrupt right away. Just watch her pacing. Women like her, they build steam. Let them think they have the floor. Then smile. Let your face say, you're emotional. Even if you don't say a word, the audience will hear it. Trust me, they always do. A male voice chuckled off mic. Someone else chimed in. So it's like polite disruption? Karoline laughed. Exactly, it's performance. But if you stay calm, she'll do the work for you. She'll over-explain, she'll show frustration, and by then, she's already lost. There was no anger in her tone, no spite. That was what made it so chilling. She wasn't venting, she was training. Elijah didn't speak for a long time. He simply let the recording finish. It ran 23 minutes and 28 seconds, long enough to erase any plausible deniability, long enough to draw a straight, brutal line between Karoline's televised attack and the campaign culture that had carefully rehearsed it. He forwarded the file to Jasmine's secure drive, then called her. She answered on the first ring. He didn't offer a greeting, only 6 words. We have her voice. It's real. When Jasmine listened to the audio later that day, she didn't flinch. She didn't take notes. She just stood by the window in her district office, arms crossed, while the training unfolded in her earbuds like a tactical breakdown from the enemy's playbook. With every passing minute, the pieces snapped into place. The constant interruptions during live panels, the passive smirks, the smothering politeness that never quite masked the blade underneath. She hadn't imagined the performance. She had survived it. And now she had evidence that it had never been personal. It had been procedural, scripted, standard. One line in particular lodged itself like a splinter beneath her skin. Let the audience do the rest. It wasn't just manipulation, it was exploitation. It didn't aim to challenge her policies. It aimed to weaponize the very stereotypes she had spent her life resisting. That a black woman raising her voice must be angry. That measured confidence must be arrogance. That silence must be admission. Jasmine didn't need a press statement. She didn't need to explain herself. What she held in her hand was no longer a defense. It was proof of design, of strategy masquerading as spontaneity. Back in Elijah's office, the legal team dissected every syllable of the recording, cataloging timestamps, speaker IDs, tonal shifts, and phrases designed to incite. They cross-referenced the tactics with Karoline's televised attack down to the moment she smiled into the camera after leveling her false accusations. Every move, every tone, every calculated breath had been rehearsed like choreography. It wasn't a miscalculation. It was a deliberate narrative trap. And Jasmine had walked into it in real time and refused to take the bait. The significance of the recording couldn't be overstated. It turned speculation into certainty. It turned public discomfort into judicial gravity. What had once been dismissed by some as a bad faith debate moment was now revealed for what it truly was, an orchestrated strategy designed to fracture the credibility of women of color on live television. And Jasmine, she hadn't just endured it. She had outlasted it, without raising her voice, without playing into their hands. She had survived a battlefield built specifically to break her, and emerged standing, while Karoline's mask now lay in pieces at her feet. And as the damning audio settled into the bloodstream of the public narrative like venom, the fallout began mutating, moving from private outrage to cultural autopsy. But the next blow didn't come from a courtroom, a headline, or a microphone. It came from a dorm room lit only by the glow of a laptop screen and the fury of someone who refused to let the lie stand unchallenged. At 2:08 a.m., Layla Jordan, a second-year media studies student at Howard University, posted a video to TikTok that would gut the national conversation like a scalpel. No filters, no dramatic music, just precision. The screen was split in two. On the left, Karoline Leavitt's now infamous panel performance, frozen mid-sentence, her hand raised with smug confidence as she accused Jasmine Crockett of corruption. On the right, a close-up of the leaked Talking Points for Minority Opponents document, each section annotated in bright red. The caption across the middle was devastating in its simplicity. This wasn't spontaneous. It was rehearsed. Layla's voice guided the video, calm but cutting. "Let's watch this together," she said. Here's Karoline saying Jasmine's tone is unbecoming of leadership. Now look at the document. Page 4, use civility as a weapon, suggest emotional instability. She tapped her screen, then let the clip roll again. Next, she interrupts during the first 15 seconds of Jasmine's response. Page 2, interrupt early to derail rhythm. The video built momentum not through spectacle, but with chilling clarity. By the time she got to Karoline's smug closing smile and paired it with the tactic from the document, smirk to imply they're overreacting, it didn't feel like coincidence anymore. It felt like a trap that had finally been exposed frame by frame. The response was volcanic. Within the first hour, the video had 750,000 views. By sunrise, it had crossed 4 million. But more than views, it was the engagement that told the real story. The comments poured in by the thousands, law students quoting constitutional implications, activists calling for formal ethics reviews, working professionals admitting they'd seen the pattern before but never had the proof. "This is not just a takedown," one user wrote. "This is what structural bias looks like when it's caught on tape." Another simply commented, "She didn't lose control. She was under attack, and she knew it." The virality moved fast. Across Twitter, Instagram Reels, even LinkedIn, where political consultants began dissecting the clip with uncomfortable candor. But it wasn't just the internet. By midday, traditional media picked up the scent like blood and water. The Atlantic was the first to strike. Their feature dropped just after noon with the kind of headline that doesn't blink. "Humiliation isn't opinion, it's a strategy." The article didn't waste time. It framed Karoline's performance not as a rogue moment of televised friction, but as the most recent example in a decades-old pattern of weaponizing optics against women of color. It cited prior moments, Maxine Waters being called unhinged, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being interrupted in finance hearings, Kamala Harris being labeled aggressive mid-sentence. But it wasn't the history that stunned readers. It was the specificity. "This isn't about tone," the piece declared. "It's about designing rhetorical cages, then punishing women for trying to speak from inside them." Jasmine's name was mentioned 6 times. Her quotes, 0. She hadn't spoken, hadn't reacted, hadn't posted a word. That was the most powerful detail of all. The piece didn't elevate her voice, it elevated her restraint. And in doing so, it reframed silence not as absence, but as strategy. Jasmine was not hiding. She was watching the world indict itself. Meanwhile, Karoline's side scrambled. Her social media pages stalled. Her podcast feed went dark. The comms team, what remained of it, had no messaging plan. Because how do you spin a strategy document when a 19-year-old just turned it into national curriculum in real time? How do you deny intent when the internet has already made a forensic timeline of your cruelty, when they've clipped your smirk and slowed it down to the very frame that proves you practiced it? For Jasmine, this moment should have been vindicating. It should have been cause for a press conference, a TV appearance, a celebratory tweet. But none came. She didn't share Layla's video. She didn't retweet the Atlantic article. She didn't call a single reporter. Instead, she attended a housing subcommittee hearing that afternoon, on time, prepared, composed, asked 3 precise questions, then left through the side entrance like any other legislator. No camera crew, no soundbite, no spectacle. But the stillness around her only made the storm louder. That silence, the same silence Karoline tried to bait on national television, was now the signal that Jasmine had no need to defend herself. Because the country was doing it for her. Because a college student had peeled back the curtain. Because the Atlantic had slammed the gavel. Because every tactic once thought too subtle to prove had now been rendered undeniable by evidence, exposure, and the collective memory of a public that refused to be gaslit again. And Jasmine, she remained still. Because sometimes the loudest sound in the room is the silence no one can talk over. But even as the world echoed with condemnation, and her silence stood taller than any microphone, Jasmine knew the final move wouldn't come from social media. It would come wrapped in legal language, inked with desperation. The email arrived at 9:02 a.m., marked confidential settlement proposal from the law offices representing Karoline Leavitt. It didn't scream, it didn't grovel, it didn't even try to explain. Just 5 bullet points, clinical and calculated, typed in clean serif font and ending with a clause Jasmine read twice. An 8-figure payout, a formal agreement to withdraw from all public-facing media for no less than 24 months. No television, no podcast appearances, no interviews, panels, commentaries, op-eds, or advisory roles. Digital silence, personal retreat, institutional vanishing. The document made no admission of guilt, no apology, no retraction, only absence, priced and packaged. Jasmine sat at the long wooden table in her district office, the lights low, blinds half drawn against the Texas sun slicing across the room. Her legal team surrounded her, Elijah to her left, Samira across from her, 2 junior associates flipping through printouts. But none of them spoke as she stared at the final clause. It wasn't the money that anchored the moment, though the zeros carried gravity. It was the condition of disappearance. The terms weren't crafted to settle. They were built to erase, to redact Karoline's voice from public memory without ever acknowledging why. And yet, that very absence would become the headline. Not guilt, not growth, just removal. She leaned back in her chair, hands still folded on the table, then finally broke the silence. Her voice was even, quiet, but filled the room like a verdict. Does her silence now deserve the same weight mine carried? The question didn't hang in the air. It sliced through it. Elijah blinked, glanced down at the settlement document again, but said nothing. He knew exactly what she meant. Jasmine's silence had never been retreat. It had been resistance. It had been strategy. It had been the only language left when her dignity was being stripped live, in high definition. And now Karoline wanted to claim the same silence, but as an exit strategy. Not earned, not endured, bought. Samira shifted forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied Jasmine's face. She's not choosing silence. She's choosing invisibility over accountability. Jasmine nodded slightly but said nothing. She didn't need to, because behind her stillness was fire. She remembered the look in Karoline's eyes during that panel. Cool, calculating, certain. She remembered the sound of her own breath as she sat frozen, accused in front of millions, knowing if she raised her voice by even an inch too high, it would be twisted into aggression. She remembered the burn of restraint, the cost of composure, the smirks, the laughter, the headlines questioning her reaction instead of the attack. And now Karoline, when faced with consequences, wanted to vanish quietly. No court ruling, no testimony, just a check and a vanishing act. Jasmine stood slowly, circled to the window, the folder still in hand. Outside, the city moved as it always did. Cars, pedestrians, ordinary noise. But inside, the storm continued. The offer was real, legally binding. It would end everything. It would fund policy initiatives, mentorship programs, legal clinics for women like her who didn't have access to national stages. And yet, accepting it would mean letting Karoline leave through a side door, never answering for what had been done by design. Elijah finally spoke, his voice low, cautious. It's leverage, Jazz. You control the timeline. You control the language. If you say yes, she disappears. You win the war. Quietly. Jasmine didn't turn from the window. And what do we lose? She asked. Who tells the story then? No one answered. She walked back to the table, her fingers brushing over the signature line. The weight of the pen had never felt heavier. It wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about the blueprint that had been exposed, and whether allowing Karoline to vanish without public consequence would send a message louder than any court ruling ever could. Her silence had forced the country to listen, but was it enough to let the noise simply stop now? She looked at Elijah again. The question isn't whether we settle. It's whether we let this become a pattern that ends in whispers and payouts. He nodded slowly. Samira folded her arms. We're not just choosing closure. We're defining the cost of harm. Outside, the light shifted across the room. Jasmine sat down again. The folder remained open. The silence thickened. Not the silence of surrender, but of deliberation, of legacy, of the space where impact is decided, not just felt. She didn't pick up the pen. Not yet. And so the folder stayed on the desk, untouched, unsigned, while the city turned without pause and the world waited for Jasmine's next move. The offer was there, undeniable in its magnitude. 8 figures, silence in exchange for silence, erasure dressed up as resolution. And yet Jasmine didn't move. Not that night, not the next. For 48 hours, she stepped off the grid in plain sight. No staff briefings, no social media activity, no phone calls to her legal team. She didn't answer Elijah's texts. She didn't open the court alerts stacking in her inbox. Instead, she existed in the quiet, walking through her neighborhood without sunglasses, shopping for groceries like a civilian, cooking her own meals without music. It wasn't avoidance. It was measurement. And every moment was a needle on a scale, weighing not just the offer, but the meaning behind it. The folder traveled with her, tucked into her tote bag at the farmer's market, sitting beside her coffee while she read through old policy drafts, resting on the kitchen counter while she sliced vegetables with surgical precision. She didn't read it again. She didn't need to. She had memorized every clause. It wasn't the language that haunted her. It was the idea of permanence. What would it mean if she signed? What would she be accepting? That justice was better handled in the quiet back rooms of negotiation? That the loudest insults could be buried under non-disclosure agreements and polite phrases like mutual resolution? That silence could be bought and sold depending on who was holding the pen? She spent the second night sitting alone in her living room. No lights but the ones from across the street filtering through the window blinds. The folder lay unopened on her coffee table, her phone face down, her tea gone cold. She remembered the panel moment, the exact breath she took before Karoline leveled that false accusation, the weight of every eye in the room, the knowledge that if she reacted with 1 inch of visible rage, she'd confirm every unspoken stereotype Karoline's team had built into their attack strategy. Jasmine hadn't flinched then. She had held. And now she wondered, was this moment any different? Because this offer, it wasn't accountability. It was containment. It wasn't restitution. It was retreat. By the third morning, the city had shifted again. Headlines speculated. Analysts theorized. Will she take the deal? Is this a win behind closed doors? Is Jasmine negotiating in silence? But she wasn't negotiating. She was reflecting. Not on Karoline, but on herself. On the years she had spent navigating rooms that doubted her before she spoke, on the times she had swallowed her truth to protect someone else's comfort, on the endless meetings where her calm was interpreted as compliance. She had been told to be reasonable so many times it had nearly drowned her voice. And now here was another document, professional, legal, clinical, asking her to be reasonable again, to choose peace, to walk away. But Jasmine had learned something in the fire. Not every peace is earned. Some are constructed like cages and painted gold. At 11:26 a.m. on the second day, she returned to her office. The staff didn't greet her. They knew. The energy was quiet but electric. The folder was still there, right where she'd left it on the edge of her desk. She didn't sit. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't ask for company. She simply opened the folder, scanned the signature line one last time, picked up the pen, and signed. Then she whispered not to anyone, but to herself, "This is not a settlement. This is a boundary." The room didn't cheer. There was no applause. Only stillness and gravity, because the signature wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Jasmine hadn't signed to end the fight. She had signed to define its perimeter, to say this far, no further. Karoline would be gone from the airwaves, stripped of her stage, not by cancellation, but by consequence. And Jasmine's silence would not be mirrored. It would be magnified, because this agreement didn't equal silence. It was the price Karoline paid to be excluded from Jasmine's voice, a boundary drawn in ink and power. Samira entered minutes later, reading her face before speaking. "Is it done?" Jasmine nodded once. "Then so is she," Samira said. And it wasn't triumph in her voice. It was closure. And somewhere, Jasmine finally allowed herself to exhale, not in celebration, but in relief. Not because the pain had been resolved, but because the narrative had been reclaimed. And outside, the city moved as if nothing had changed. But something had. Jasmine hadn't just survived the fire. She had mapped it, contained it, and now finally she had extinguished it on her own terms. And as Jasmine's signature dried beneath the fluorescent lights of her office, silent, final, surgical, the world outside began reshaping itself around what that moment had meant. Because the impact wasn't confined to court filings or vanishing media figures. It pulsed outward, into classrooms, into curriculums, into the minds of students who had watched this battle unfold in real time and saw something they weren't used to seeing. A woman of color refusing to combust, refusing to play the villain in someone else's script, refusing to win with noise when restraint cut deeper. The media had moved on. The lawsuits had settled. But in lecture halls and school auditoriums across the country, Jasmine Crockett had become something larger than scandal or spectacle. She had become a case study in controlled power. At Princeton School of Public Affairs, a professor scrolled through a paused clip of Jasmine's now viral panel moment on a projector screen and turned to her students. "What you're seeing isn't avoidance," she said. "It's tactical dignity under pressure." The class sat still, listening, not to shouting, but to stillness. Across the country at Spelman College, the Political Communications Department added a new module to its spring curriculum, Silence as Strategy, the Crockett Doctrine. The core reading wasn't a court brief, it was a transcript of the panel, annotated with emotional cues, body language shifts, and microaggressions delivered with a smile. Students debated not whether Jasmine had done the right thing, but what it had cost her to do it. Because that's what the world so often forgot, that holding the line wasn't free, it was excruciating. In a high school in Sacramento, an 11th grade civics class broke into groups to discuss responsible responses to public provocation. One student played Karoline's ambush clip. Another played Layla Jordan's TikTok side by side with the leaked talking points memo. Then the room fell quiet as Jasmine's voice, calm, unshaken, delivered that now immortal phrase, "I'll answer you in court." No yelling, no retaliation, just precision. The teacher wrote on the board. Accountability doesn't always sound like anger. And beneath it, responsibility isn't silence. It's choice. In debate clubs from Baltimore to Berkeley, Jasmine's handling of the situation became an example of what they began calling measured resistance, not because it was weak, but because it was undeniable. Judges across state-level competitions started recognizing students not just for sharp comebacks, but for emotional control under duress. At one state final, when a black student was intentionally interrupted 3 times in under a minute, she simply paused, breathed, and continued with a composure that sent the auditorium into a stunned silence. Afterward, when asked how she didn't snap, she said, "I watched Congresswoman Crockett. She didn't fight fire with fire. She watched the room burn and didn't blink." But the most powerful shift wasn't institutional, it was generational. Middle schoolers, barely old enough to vote, began quoting Jasmine's courtroom response in essays about bullying, racial bias, and social media pressure. One 8th grader in Michigan wrote, "She didn't make noise. She made change." And that's louder. At a youth leadership retreat in Denver, students were given scenarios involving provocation, personal attacks, and targeted humiliation. The goal wasn't to fight back harder, it was to respond with consequence, not reaction. And over, Jasmine's image appeared not as a politician, but as an archetype, the woman who held her breath and made the country hold theirs. Meanwhile, her silence, still never publicly broken, had morphed into something mythic. Educators called it a masterclass in restraint. Crisis managers called it a blueprint for dignified dissent. But in classrooms, it was something deeper. It was proof. Proof that composure wasn't weakness, that not clapping back didn't mean surrender, that justice didn't always arrive with a shout, but sometimes with a signature. And Jasmine's was the signature that redrew the line between humiliation and strategy, between outrage and ownership, between reaction and resolution. Because in a world obsessed with viral rage, what Jasmine had done was so rare it had to be taught. And so it was. She hadn't just rewritten the rules. She'd made them readable. And students, young, alert, watching, were now learning how to live by them. Not to imitate her silence, but to understand its power. To know that sometimes the sharpest thing you can do is not play the game they've trained you to lose. And after the storm had quieted, after Karoline's empire had begun to crumble, after legal filings had settled like dust in the Capitol's air, after networks had turned their cameras elsewhere, something far quieter happened, but it landed like thunder in the silence. In the low-lit dormitory of a liberal arts college just outside of Atlanta, a young black woman named Maya sat at her desk, headphones off, breath shallow. She had just rewatched the national broadcast of Jasmine Crockett's hearing, again. Not for the headlines, not for the spectacle, but for that moment. The one where Jasmine had said nothing, no retaliation, no raised voice. Just that haunting, surgical line. "I'll answer you in court." It wasn't just a response. It was architecture, something Maya had never seen before. Something built out of control, precision, and restraint. And it made her question everything she'd ever been taught about how to survive in spaces not built for her. She opened her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then typed, "Dear Congresswoman Crockett, I watched what you did on national television. Not just once, but 5 times. And each time, something in me unraveled and reassembled. I've spent years thinking that to be heard, I had to be loud. That if I didn't shout, I'd vanish. But you stood still, and the whole world listened. You taught me I don't have to scream to be heard. And for the first time, I believe I can lead without breaking first. Thank you." She stared at the message. Her thumb trembled above the send button. Then quietly she clicked and sat in the soft glow of her screen, crying. Not because she was sad, but because someone had finally modeled power in a language her soul recognized. The email arrived at 2:08 a.m. Capital Time. Jasmine wasn't awake, but one of her senior aides, still at her desk because the world hadn't yet calmed down, flagged it and paused. Unlike the deluge of political commentary, this wasn't opinion. It was witness. There was no hashtag, no link, no trending clip. Just a young woman typing from the seams of her own becoming, saying, "I saw you, and now I see myself." When Jasmine read it the next morning, she didn't forward it. She didn't mention it in press briefings. She didn't post it to social media with a long caption. She printed it on thick paper stock and folded it into her daily journal. She held it like evidence, but not legal evidence, spiritual evidence, that all the restraint, all the silence, all the calculated endurance had landed somewhere real, that even if the world was addicted to noise, somewhere in that chaos, stillness had created a ripple. She closed the journal, sat in her office, and looked out toward the National Mall, where monuments stood for wars fought with bullets and bayonets. But hers had been fought with breath, with composure, with every ounce of discipline not to meet fire with fire. And now, far from the courtrooms and networks, a student she'd never met had become a kind of living monument to what Jasmine had proven. That dignity can echo louder than rage. That to be still in the face of humiliation is not weakness, it is strategy. It is lineage. It is inheritance. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett finally allowed herself a private smile. Not of pride, of confirmation. She had not shouted. She had not bent. She had simply stood still, and the next generation had heard her anyway. And as Jasmine quietly folded Maya's email into her journal like a sacred vow, the echo of restraint moved like a shock wave across the very stage where noise once reigned supreme. On the opposite end of that silence, Karoline Leavitt vanished, not with a press release, not with an apology, just vanished. Her once dominant digital presence, which had once thrived on provocation and algorithmic outrage, began flickering like a dying signal. One morning, her Twitter account, once a daily deluge of talking points and indignation, was found deactivated. Days later, her Instagram went dark. Her podcast RSS feed, which once pushed out weekly monologues to hundreds of thousands, stalled without warning, its final episode ending mid-sentence, like a voice cut off in freefall. No sponsor stepped up to ask why. No network offered an explanation. No host filled the silence on her behalf. Producers stopped calling. Karoline, who just weeks prior had been a fixture on late-night panels and Sunday morning roundtables, became a name no one dared say aloud in green rooms. The air around her became radioactive, not because of cancellation, but because of exposure. She hadn't lost a platform. She had detonated her own foundation. The brand she built on outrage couldn't withstand the weight of a single leaked recording, or a handwritten note from a college girl, or a courtroom document titled Exhibit C, Pattern of Targeted Manipulation. She retreated to silence not out of grace, but out of necessity, because no amount of spin could unring a bell once it's been struck with the truth. Her team, once an entourage of stylists, strategists, and scheduling managers, had withered to silence as well. Emails went unanswered. Press requests were met with dead air. Rumors surfaced, whispers of a potential rebrand, a comeback narrative, a ghost-written memoir, but none of them stuck. Because the market had shifted, the appetite had changed. What once earned her airtime now reeked of calculation. And in a media landscape addicted to novelty, the scent of inauthenticity was fatal. Even her fiercest defenders had grown quiet, their allegiance crumbling not from moral clarity, but from pure, self-preserving exhaustion. In one particularly cutting moment, a mid-tier cable host, who had once begged Karoline for weekly commentary, opened a segment by saying, "Some stories unravel so completely, they leave no one to interview." The room laughed, but behind that laughter was fear. What happened to Karoline could happen to anyone who built their career on demolition without blueprints. Karoline's silence wasn't elegant. It was enforced. The networks that once praised her boldness now cited legal risk when asked about her absence. Podcasters once eager for her firebrand rhetoric had removed her name from their episode archives, quietly retitling controversial clips and disabling comment sections that had turned vicious. Her sponsors, makeup brands, nutritional supplements, political merch lines, had long since pulled their funding. The once lucrative affiliate codes she peddled now redirected to blank pages. And most telling of all, no one demanded she return. In a final attempt at relevance, one of Karoline's aides reportedly floated the idea of a redemption livestream, a raw, unscripted appeal to the public. But the response from platforms was swift and bloodless. No slot, no support, no space. The silence she once weaponized had turned on her. And in its place stood only the echo of what Jasmine had modeled with precision. Not vengeance, not vitriol, but a refusal to disappear and a refusal to perform. Karoline didn't hold a press conference. She didn't issue a farewell. She simply dissolved. Not all downfalls come with fireworks. Some arrive slowly, like dusk, until you realize the light is gone, and it's been gone for a while. And just when it seemed the storm had passed and silence reclaimed its space, the world looked to Jasmine once more. Not through headlines or hashtags, but through a folding chair in a sun-warmed church basement in Dallas. No cameras, no microphones, just community. The air carried the scent of old wood and cafeteria coffee, the room dimly lit by dusty windows and filled with worn faces looking for clarity in a world that often punished it. Jasmine stood at the front, not behind a podium but near a chalkboard, her heels scraping softly on tile as she stepped forward to speak. "Sometimes," she began, her voice even, low, yet echoing in every chest present, "silence isn't surrender. It's the sound of someone still standing." The words landed like thunder in a whisper. They didn't demand applause. They earned reverence. Around her, people nodded, not as spectators, but as witnesses. These were voters, teachers, single mothers, veterans, people who had survived systems that rarely apologized. They understood that silence can be strategy, that endurance is not weakness, that choosing not to scream is sometimes the boldest thing you can do in a world waiting to dismiss your volume as rage. And then from the third row, a child's voice rose. Not naive, not rehearsed, but honest. "Are you angry?" The question pierced the quiet like a bell. Jasmine turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting those of a young girl no older than 10, her legs swinging slightly above the floor, pink barrettes catching the afternoon sun. Jasmine smiled. Not the kind you give to cameras, but the kind you give when you fought a war no one fully saw and survived anyway. Very, she replied, but I choose not to pay for that anger with myself. The room didn't erupt. It inhaled. Because in that moment, every woman who'd ever swallowed rage to protect her future saw themselves reflected. Every man who'd lost something by reacting instead of responding heard a blueprint for restraint. It wasn't about submission. It was about preservation, about not letting your enemies decide the shape of your silence or the tempo of your retaliation. And as Jasmine stepped down from the front, the crowd didn't cheer. They rose, because what they had just witnessed wasn't a speech. It was a survival lesson, one that wouldn't trend, one that wouldn't air, but one that would echo. And because that single exchange between Jasmine and the little girl distilled the conflict into a living parable, the next breath in the room was no longer about lawsuits or leaked memos. It was about the deeper human lesson pulsing beneath every headline and hashtag, the lesson that would outlive both victory and scandal. The first thing that lesson demanded was clarity. Injustice rarely screams its name. It often arrives disguised as civility, perfectly tailored, expertly paced, counting on its target to erupt and confirm the stereotype it built in advance. But Jasmine had refused that invitation, and in doing so, she exposed a truth many had felt but never seen proved in daylight. That controlling your voice when someone weaponizes your silence is the most radical act of self-preservation. People in power expect humiliation to trigger rage, because rage is easy to dismiss and even easier to monetize. Restraint, by contrast, unsettles them, reorders the stage, makes the aggressor explain the empty space where chaos should have been. The humanitarian lesson, then, begins here. Dignity is not the absence of anger. It is the discipline to spend that anger only where it earns interest for the next generation. On every television set, Jasmine's stillness looked simple, but inside that stillness lived 1,000 swallowed retorts, each one costing her a fragment of comfort she will never get back. And yet she paid it, because she understood that every audience, especially the unseen, unheard, unprotected, was studying her reaction like scripture, hunting for a pattern to survive their own invisible wars. So when she finally answered that little girl, Jasmine wasn't telling just one child about measured fury. She was telling every future witness that composure can be a fist if you know how to clench it without closing your hand. The second flare of the lesson is that power rooted in empathy detonates more slowly, but leaves a deeper crater because it changes the soil itself rather than merely scorching the surface. At the Dallas gathering, people expected a rallying cry, maybe even a tidy moral delivered in textbook cadence. But Jasmine gave them something raw, a confession that her calm was expensive, that her silence was a forged shield hammered from every time she had been told to tone it down. Those words, "I choose not to pay with myself," resonated precisely because they acknowledged the cost no court ruling can refund. The emotional tax of having to prove you deserve the very oxygen someone else takes for granted. In that confession lies a radical form of public service, refusing to model self-destruction as the only path to social change. By illustrating the price of restraint, Jasmine reframed heroism from dramatic sacrifice into strategic sustainability, teaching that movements die when their leaders burn out for applause they never truly wanted. Audience members later said they left the meeting carrying a strange blend of fury and relief. Fury at the system that made her swallow so much. Relief that she showed swallowing is not the same as choking. In classrooms days later, teachers replayed that quote and asked students to write essays on the economics of anger, challenging them to calculate what is lost when dignity is forced to scream to prove it exists. The exercise revealed a collective exhaustion with performative outrage and a budding hunger for resistance that heals the resistor even while confronting the abuse. Jasmine's presence turned that hunger into curriculum, giving language to people who had only ever tasted bitterness but never named it on paper. Third, the humanitarian takeaway insists on a dangerous honesty. Structural bias survives not because it is invisible, but because it is tediously predictable. a factory line of tiny humiliations that break targets before audiences realize a weapon has been drawn. Karoline's downfall wasn't a random implosion. It was the inevitable collapse of a strategy built on that factory line being hidden. Jasmine's legal victory, though quiet, flung open the warehouse doors, forcing the public to inventory every conveyor belt of manipulation humming beneath political theater. The leaked talking points document became required reading in multiple communication courses, not as a relic of villainy, but as a decrypted playbook students must recognize in future boardrooms, newsrooms, and legislative floors. Professors asked their classes to reverse engineer those tactics into an ethical firewall, challenging each student to propose real-time counters that protect dignity without surrendering potency. Through that exercise, the humanitarian lesson crystallized. Oppression thrives in patterns. Break the pattern, and you break the spell. Jasmine didn't dismantle the factory in one night, but she forced its blueprint into daylight, and daylight is deadly for machinery designed to work in shadows. Now, every time a pundit smiles condescendingly at a whistleblower, or a senator interrupts a witness with feigned civility, a portion of the audience spots the gears turning and calls it by its truest name: engineered discredit. That collective recognition, born from one woman's refusal to combust, marks the slow erosion of an empire built on manufactured meltdowns. Fourth, the lesson warns that silence has a half-life. Wielded wrongly, it poisons the witness. Wielded well, it poisons the lie. Jasmine's signature on the settlement was a masterclass in ensuring her stillness remained antidote, not toxin. By stating this is a boundary, she converted hush money into hush accountability, turning the very tool meant to erase wrongdoing into a monument to consequence. Community leaders have since used that move as precedent, advising activists to negotiate remedies that force offenders off the stage rather than trap survivors behind non-disclosure gags. In seminars on survivor advocacy, counselors cite Jasmine's approach as the silent closure model, emphasizing that true closure isn't people forgetting the harm. It's the harm no longer paying rent to the memory of it. The humanitarian core here is nuanced. One must discern when silence liberates and when it enslaves, because both wear the same mask. Jasmine's meticulous choice underlined that distinction with Courtroom Inc., teaching observers that every forced apology and every performative meltdown is worthless if it demands your voice as part of the payment plan. Fifth, the lesson reveals that redemption, contrary to popular myth, is not universal. It's custom-made, invoice by invoice. Karoline tried to purchase redemption wholesale, 8 figures and 24 months of invisibility. The world declined the offer because redemption without confession is just a quieter form of escapism. In ethics workshops across the nation, facilitators now present Karoline's retreat as the absence fallacy, illustrating how disappearing can be weaponized to evade growth. Students debate whether a public figure should be allowed a comeback without demonstrating tangible repair to the community harmed. Overwhelmingly, they conclude that pause is not penance. The humanitarian takeaway is clear. Redemption demands accountability that outlasts the news cycle. Anything less is a brand refresh, not a moral resurrection. Sixth, the Dallas Hall itself became a microcosm of democratic possibility. A politician speaking without microphones, a community listening without spectacle, a child interrogating power without fear. That constellation of interactions proved that civic spaces do not require grand stages. They require honest proximity. City planners have since cited the forum as evidence that local governance thrives when stripped of pomp. Smaller rooms, shorter speeches, longer listening sessions. In those rooms, the humanitarian lesson breathes. Justice is not a transaction between giants. It is a dialogue among neighbors. If leaders wish to legislate empathy, they must first practice it in basements, folding chairs, and school cafeterias, where eye contact is inevitable and platitudes suffocate. Seventh, Jasmine's exchange with the girl reframed anger itself as a resource, not a liability. In psychology circles, therapists now unpack her quote, "But I choose not to pay for that anger with myself," as a mantra for trauma stewardship. Clients are taught to visualize anger as a currency. You can invest, donate, squander, or save it, but you cannot pretend it doesn't exist. This reframing dismantles the stereotype that marginalized people must either internalize rage or erupt destructively. Instead, Jasmine's model offers a third path: strategic expenditure, where anger funds boundaries rather than fires. The therapist guides clients through scenarios. What does paying with yourself look like here? What does investing your anger wisely look like? In this framework, Jasmine's restraint becomes a psychological tool, not a political anecdote. Eighth, media literacy programs now place Jasmine's saga alongside classic propaganda studies, illustrating how misinformation thrives on emotional sabotage. Students dissect how Karoline weaponized the suspicion that women of color will break under pressure, then compare it to historical propaganda tropes used against activists like Angela Davis and Shirley Chisholm. They learn that the enemy of manipulation is not merely fact-checking, it is composure long enough for evidence to surface and contradictions to collapse under their own weight. Jasmine's trial becomes an equation. Silence plus documentation equals explosive truth. The equation is then stress-tested in simulated debates where one participant uses condescension to provoke while the other practices measured response. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.